Good morning. Welcome to this call sponsored by the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition in our ongoing series of public service opportunities to hear and to learn a little bit more about what's going on and what's been happening over the last few weeks. Just want to mention a few things for those who would like to join us, and that is on Monday. You can go to the same place, to the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, which is, or just the ZionistRabbis.org, and sign up to participate in the call with Yossi Cooperwasser, who is a security expert and advisor on Israeli affairs to a number of Israeli governments. He'll be talking on the topic of what has Israel gained or accomplished, and was it worth it? That'll be a Monday morning. He'll be coming to us from Israel at 10 a.m. Please know that on Thursday of next week, there'll be an open discussion forum. This is for rabbis, and only those who are members of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. Talk an open town hall meeting about where do we stand, where do we go from here, what have we learned, and things like that. So those who are members, those rabbis who are on the call, if you're not yet a member, please do consider joining the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. And if you're not a rabbi, please do consider making a contribution to the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition at our website, ZionistRabbis.org. And finally, if you are a rabbi, please do sign a letter that we have going around. It's up to a little beyond, I think, 140, a letter of support of Israel, and that you can also find on our website as well. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who is Senior Vice President at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where he oversees a number of different departments and does research. He's worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he played a key role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. Jonathan is the author of numerous articles. In fact, just this morning, I think he wrote 5. Just kidding. But he did already publish an article this morning, which is of relevance to all of us, and 3 books, which also are very important. One is called The State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. One is called Hamas versus Fatah, The Struggle for Palestine, and Al-Qaeda's armies, Middle East affiliate groups, and the next generation of terror. So Jonathan is obviously very well qualified. He's an expert on the Middle East, travels often to the Middle East, and testifies frequently before Congress, as well as in the American and international media, with extensive ties to the area. Jonathan, it is a pleasure to have you with us and to hear what you're going to share with us this morning. To the extent individuals have questions, please put them in the chat box. Boker Tov. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning. Thank you, Rabbi, for having me, and thanks for your leadership, not only at B'nai Tzedek, but clearly among other conservative rabbis who are supportive of Israel.
Thank you, Jonathan. So let's get started right away, and that is, from your perspective, what do you think initiated this most recent round of fighting? We've heard that it was the Alaska Israeli troops up there in Sheikh Jarrah, Israeli evictions of Palestinians. From your perspective and study and analysis of all that's going on and extensive reading of all the different press in the area, what do you think?
So, I think that is a key question to try to answer. I think there are a number of factors that led to this most recent conflict. I don't believe the Sheikh Jarrah real estate dispute was the key issue. I think, for anyone who's taken a look at this, for just, reading a couple of paragraphs on it, you'll realize that this is a longstanding legal dispute dating back actually 100 years, that they were Jews that had the deed to a handful of homes in Eastern Jerusalem. They went to Israel's very legitimate judiciary system to try to basically make a claim. This wound its way through Israel's legal system, and the decision, or at least the interim decision, appeared to be that there was grounds for an eviction. The Israelis in question actually were more than willing to allow the families in this real estate to pay rent, and they refused. And when that did not happen, then you began to see an escalation of the problem. But this was not something that happened all at once. It was something that that many people were already aware of. I think the real reasons for this are probably twofold. The first was Palestinian politics. As we say, all politics are local. I think that very much holds in the Palestinian context. We had this drama that came right before this most recent round of conflict, where elections were slated to take place. They were announced back in September of last year in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords. The Palestinians, I think, rightfully were concerned that their cause was being eclipsed by the normalization agreements that we saw across the region with the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco and others that were also considering normalization deals with Israel. So they said, okay, well, we have to hold elections and begin to formalize and legitimize our own political system after 14 years of conflict. Of course, this dates back to 2007 when there was a civil war that broke out in the Gaza Strip, and Hamas remained in control there, with the PLO clinging to control in the West Bank. But basically, the elections looked like they were going to tilt in favor of Hamas, and the United States and Israel. The U.S. came a little late to the party, I have to admit, and I do think that the Biden administration deserves some blame for that. But ultimately, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, canceled those elections, thereby basically pushing Hamas out of the political process. Wasn't the first time, probably won't be the last, but I think Hamas was looking to reassert itself, reassert its primacy in the Palestinian political arena. And of course, firing rockets at Israel is wildly popular and garners quite a bit of support, particularly in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. The other thing that I'll just note is that all of this is taking place in the context of what the Israelis call the war between wars. This is a gray zone or shadow war that's been taking place across the Middle East, where, of course, Iran has been using proxy terrorist groups to attack Israel for decades. But Israel, over the last, let's say, year or two, has stepped up its attacks in the gray zone, as we call it, generally non-attributable warfare tactics, where the Israelis have been taking out Iranian vessels in the Gulf of Oman or in the Red Sea. They have been taking out weapons that were being shipped to Hezbollah in Syria, and even took out a number of senior Iranian commanders in the process. There's also the cyber war that we've seen Israel wage against nuclear facilities. And so the Iranians, I think, after really getting knocked around quite a bit by the IDF, decided to turn the table here and use their proxy in Gaza to launch a war. And Hamas, already frustrated, already looking to assert itself, was only too happy to be used in this context. And by the way, for anyone who's wondering whether this is an established fact, Ismail Haniyeh, the political head of Hamas today, gave a speech out of Qatar thanking Iran directly for the weapons that it provided during this war.
So Jonathan, I asked you a question. It took you about 7 minutes to answer it, and I'm sure there's even more. That's one of our problems, isn't it? No, seriously, the Palestinian side will just say it's the occupation in one word, and then they garner the public support. Is there a way in which, you know, that can be filtered down into a, you know, a shorter soundbite to understand? I don't know. Maybe it's a rhetorical question.
No, it's not. I mean, I'll just tell you this: this is an Iranian proxy war, and Hamas has been edged out of the political process, which is deeply dysfunctional, and they're looking to carry out violence instead of participating in politics. That's probably the easiest way to describe it.
Okay, so some people then just say that this trying to attribute it to Bibi wanting this war to happen or trying to blame him. Talk about that a little bit, please.
Well, you know, I think it's a bit ridiculous, especially with a little bit of hindsight. Of course, you know, Bibi had just lost his mandate heading into this war. He was unable to form a coalition in the Knesset, was unable to get those 61 seats. And so we had this very strange moment, actually, with Yair Lapid, a center-left politician, joining forces with Naftali Bennett, a right-wing settler-supporting politician. The two of them appeared to be on track to form some sort of unity government, a very strange marriage. And then after the war broke out, Bennett decided that he was not the right person to be prime minister and that the right needed to circle the wagons. And so he left this coalition with Lapid, and it appeared to give Netanyahu a new lifeline, a new political lifeline. And that's been the narrative that we've seen in the media for the last 11 days. Except here's the problem. As soon as the war ended, Netanyahu has been slammed by the right in Israel for having just mowed the lawn in Gaza and for not having changed the equation with Hamas and not having actually addressed the core issues, so to speak, with this conflict. And I think Israelis rightfully expect within the next 2 to 5 or 7 years for there to be yet another conflict with Hamas. It'll probably be as painful or more so than the conflict that we just saw. And so I think Bibi is going to be taking a good bit of heat from the right, and I don't necessarily think that this is going to redound to his benefit. We're going to probably have a 5th round of elections, and his political adversaries are going to have quite a bit of ammunition on him for how he handled the war. Even if I think he did a fairly decent job, he was limited because, without putting boots on the ground, without eradicating Hamas, this conflict will continue.
How successful was Israel? And we'll hear more about this on Monday from Yossi Kupperwasser. But how successful was Israel in achieving some of its military goals? What were some of those goals? And in that context, could you talk a little bit about that bombing of the AP building, please?
Sure. So I think Israel accomplished all of its goals. You have to understand that every time Israel goes into one of these conflicts, it has what they call a target bank. Over the past 7 years, the Israelis have been collecting targets in Gaza, watching with satellites, watching with human intelligence, monitoring what Hamas was doing and preparing for its next conflict with Israel. So the Israelis used their target bank, virtually depleted it. And that meant taking out rocket production facilities, rocket storage facilities. The senior commanders involved with Hamas, some of the better trained fighters. I think a real win for Israel was the destruction of what the IDF has been calling the Hamas metro system. This was the underground labyrinth of tunnels that Hamas had spent years building and preparing for a underground commando type conflict against Israeli ground forces. And here, I know it's somewhat controversial, but I have to say Israel pulled off quite a coup when they faked out the media by saying that they were going to be putting ground troops, or that they already had inserted ground troops in Gaza. It was reported, it was on their Twitter feed in both English and Hebrew, but then it was picked up by the Wall Street Journal and Reuters and others. And all of a sudden, Hamas realized that they needed to, flood the tunnels with their commando fighters. And that's when Israel bombed the tunnels and really took away all the element of surprise and obviated the need to go in on the ground. So they really, I think, accomplished a lot with that one maneuver. I know there will be some, let's say, some sore reporters right now, people who are a little grumpy with Israel for having faked them out. But I would say that from Israel's perspective, it's probably better to win than to be loved, especially with the treatment that Israel often gets in the media. I think they probably saw very little downside to doing so. By the way, I'll also just note that the spokesman for the IDF, Jonathan Conricus, who I've worked with for many years now, this was, I think, his swan song. And you won't, I think, probably hear much about this in the media, but he has about 4 weeks left to go as the spokesman of the IDF. And this was, I think, his moment to play a role in an IDF military operation.
So we'll talk more about the press coverage later, but please now, in regard to that AP building bombing, and tell us about that a little bit.
Sure. So, Israel obviously took out a building that housed the Al Jazeera offices and the AP offices. It was obviously something that angered the Palestinians. For a moment, it really looked like the United States was going to be upset about this too. From what we understand, the Israelis shared the intelligence that they had. And we've not been able to see the specifics of it, but the Israelis allege and apparently have proven that Hamas was running a military intelligence office within that AP building, and that was what they sought to destroy. Now, a lot of people have said, well, how is it? That's impossible. How is it that AP or Al Jazeera wouldn't know that Hamas was there? I mean, it's sort of a silly question, because it's not like Hamas is going to advertise on the building that they have an office there. You certainly can't imagine going into the elevator and seeing the floor 1 is Hamas, floor 2 is AP, floor 3 is Al Jazeera. So it was sort of a silly argument. I think from everything that we understand, the Biden administration was about to be quite angry with the Israelis until they saw the intel, and then everything got quiet again. Now, a couple of other things to just note: the explosion itself, and we're trying to get an analyst to take a closer look at this, but it did not look like it was hit by a missile. You didn't see a big, implosion. You didn't see a massive cloud come up from it being hit immediately. If anything, it looked like it was a controlled explosion where everything fell in on itself. It actually looked like it was professionally done by someone perhaps who had gotten on the inside of that building, and we're trying to substantiate that. The IDF will not confirm that to me or anyone else that's asked, but it is an interesting thing to look at. And of course, the IDF, I don't expect would ever really admit to it, but it certainly looked that way. Another interesting thing to note is that Al Jazeera has often been at the heart of controversies where it has been blamed or has been co-located with terrorists. The United States in 2004 issued a number of complaints to the Qatari government, which owns Al Jazeera, also happens to be a massive sponsor of Hamas, but ultimately leading to American airstrikes against assets in and around this Al Jazeera building in Baghdad. So you get a sense this is not the first time we've seen this. The last little postscript that I'll just note here is yesterday there was an op-ed in the New York Times. I missed it, but it is written by a woman named Layla Al-Arian. She is the son of Sami Al-Arian, who served 13 years in the United States penitentiary system for having funded the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. That's her dad. And she, in her article, noted that the family owns that building. So a really interesting wrinkle. She wrote the piece in defense of the building and how she basically was trying to say, hey, this isn't Hamas. But if you look at her family, it obviously is it's a head scratcher.
I imagine the insurance premiums are rather high there in that area right now. Jonathan, we talked a little bit about the leadership, about Bibi, and a little bit about the internecine warfare between Hamas and Fatah. Let's move to America and your assessment of President Biden, how he handled it, the tough talk. You had written an article, actually, I don't know if you want to talk about it now or how you feel about it, that some of the conversations with Iran and the negotiations, some of the steps the United States had taken may have inadvertently, unintentionally contributed something to some of the emboldening of the Hamas and Palestinians. But at the same time, it seems as if President Biden, from our perspective, pro-Israel perspective, handled things relatively well. Please talk a bit about that.
Sure. I would probably have to divide this answer up into three sort of boxes. The first thing is how we got here, and I think we can blame the Biden administration for having, let's just say, put in place some of the pieces that led to this conflict by encouraging Palestinian elections that would include Hamas. It was a huge mistake on the part of the Biden administration. We were hearing from Hadi Amr, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, that the United States had no role to play. Who are we to tell anyone whether they can or should hold elections? Except, the fact is that if they held elections and Hamas won, it would have been a major source of conflict for both the United States and Israel. And by the way, a guy named Senator Joe Biden passed legislation back in 2006 saying that the United States could not provide assistance to the Palestinian Authority if Hamas took part. So it's very strange that this administration initially said, sure, go ahead. What do we have to lose by having Hamas take part in these elections? And then ultimately, when it came to its senses, it said, don't do it. And I believe, as I already noted, that this sort of internecine conflict within the Palestinians ultimately led to let's just say, Hamas's calculus of the need to carry out a war. So I think the Biden administration deserves some blame for the kind of pretext. Now, the next thing to look at is the so-called tensions that we saw between Biden and Bibi during this 11-day war. There were none. It's really funny, but he kept giving a green light to Israel to do what it needed to do. And even when there was that moment, that inflection moment about the AP and Al Jazeera building, the Israelis brought the intelligence. It was confirmed by the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence here, and things continue to move forward. Israel had a green light to knock out Hamas terror installations, and the US government should be commended for that. Now, about 36 hours before the end of the conflict, we began to see reports, if you were watching Israeli TV, it was all over the news, that Egypt had helped broker a ceasefire and that it was coming soon and that we could all expect the war to end. And it very much felt like the end of the conflict. The target banks had been depleted. Hamas was firing rockets less frequently. You had a sense that it was going to wrap up. And that is when President Biden began talking tough about Israel. And I have to say, it was not because Israel needed to hear tough words. It was because President Biden was signaling to the progressive hard left within his party that he was taking Bibi to the woodshed, right? He needed to show them that he was being tough. He was placating his sort of his own constituents, right? So this was a message to the left. By the way, he was not alone in doing this. Bibi was messaging similar things. He's saying, "Oh, I'm not going to stop fighting until I, hit every last Hamas target," even though he knew that, the ceasefire was coming within 36 hours. By the way, Hamas too, the firing of rockets that really had no impact. They were just doing it, again, to flex a bit of muscle. But there was a lot of posturing there at the end. I don't blame Biden for doing it. And I will say he handled himself relatively well throughout the conflict. And I think he should get high marks. But then that leads us to where we're going next. And that's the real problem. And that is that the United States is about to re-enter the 2015 flawed Iran nuclear agreement. And when it does, it will be providing Iran with billions of dollars in sanctions relief. And that sanctions relief, it will not take long for that money to begin to flow to terrorist organizations that Iran sponsors. And one of those will be Hamas. So right now, Congress is about to pass a $730 million package to help replenish Iron Dome and precision-guided munitions and a bunch of things that Israel needs militarily. At the same time, the United States is about to basically underwrite Hamas as well. We will be here funding both sides of the Hamas-Israel conflict. It's a fairly insane proposition, but this is where we're going. And I can tell you that whatever tension you thought there might have been between Bibi and Biden, it was nothing. It was maybe some minor irritants here or there, but things were working very well. I am concerned, truly concerned, about the state of U.S.-Israel relations after the United States enters into the nuclear deal because of the many problems that will emerge, including the inadvertent, or perhaps, with full knowledge, the fact that the U.S. will be financing terrorism indirectly.
So in regard to the pressure on President Biden, there was the talk of Talib on the tarmac, which was a subject of front page article in today's Washington Post. And of course, those are no longer lonely voices out in the wilderness, including within the American Jewish community, including some of our rabbis as well being critical, certainly in terms of the celebrity world, John Oliver and so many others, as well as in the media and things like that. So what is, I have to tell you, many of us in the pro-Israel community are feeling very lonely and very frustrated in this regard. The media bias is out there. Jonathan, what is your sense about, the growing voices, let's stick with the Democratic Party, and pressure on the president and others to be moving in a certain direction? I mean, after all, at some point, he can only resist that for so long, so to speak.
Yeah, look, I think he probably can hold out a lot longer than folks are giving him credit for. The question is if he wants to. I mean, Biden's, as we would say, a swamp creature. He understands how Washington works. He knows that he needs to placate this constituency. It is not a large constituency at the end of the day, right? I mean, they're loud and they have a following. And unfortunately, I think they garner outsized media attention relative to what they accomplish as legislators. But I think Biden understands that they represent a small portion of the Democratic Party. The problem that I have is that there is an underlying culture that troubles me. And you see it with John Oliver, and you see it with others that are out there, sort of spouting platitudes about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, not understanding the complexities of it, not understanding that at its core, it's an issue about, the Muslim world for years has been trying to kill Israel, and Israel will not meet them halfway. That's just not how this works, right? It's a win-lose, it's a zero-sum game proposition, and Israel has been fighting that war since 1948, if not before then. And so, you have these platitudes, you've got the hard left embracing this, but it's really what we would call the woke culture that we're seeing that is spreading across the United States, that is, let's just say it engages in a sort of relativism that is eroding the very strong sense that I think we've all had of Israel's just cause. And this is the concern, is that we have kids on campus that are being taught this, and it's clear it's happening across almost every campus in the United States. The media is dominated by it, and I think it doesn't help, by the way, that Donald Trump was very pro-Israel, and this is seen to at least some extent as being a backlash against those 4 years of Trump. I think it's probably unfair, but at the same time, Netanyahu had a bromance with Trump, as we would call it, and people remember that. And look, it may be one reason why Netanyahu should consider stepping down at some point. It's not helpful any longer that he was there at the helm at a time where many people associate Israel with the wrong side of justice, if you will. That said, I would have to note, though, that Bibi is probably one of Israel's most talented politicians in its history. He understands the international community incredibly well. He understands Israel's domestic scene incredibly well. He has navigated quite a lot during his time in office. And I think it'd be a shame for Israel to lose him on the one hand. On the other hand, he has been in office since 2009, so perhaps he's past his expiration date.
You mentioned about Bibi's contacts with in the international world. Jonathan, you certainly have many contacts within the Arab Sunni Arab states and so on. Tell us a little bit, please, about how did you feel? They responded to what was going on, and then from there we'll turn to domestic politics as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I would say it was a little disappointing on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's better than it's ever been. It's better than it's ever been because you had a lot of countries that typically used to come out and really hammer Israel for defending itself, and they were quiet. UAE, Bahrain, even Saudi Arabia to a certain extent, many of them were very muted during this conflict. I mean, yes, they produced, statements that said that they wanted all sides to calm down, and they condemned the civilian casualties that we saw in Gaza, but this was boilerplate language at the end of the day. This was not vitriol as we have seen come out of the Arab world. And I have to say, while watching Israeli TV, I was also watching the Emirati channel Al Arabiya here from home. And I have to say, it used to be wall-to-wall coverage every time there was a war. I'm watching soccer news. I'm watching things about the EU. I mean, they were looking for other things to cover. Now, this is not to say that they were thrilled with Israel's operation. In particular, there was one tweet, and I can tell you this is just a small taste of kind of what we're still dealing with. There was a tweet that the Israeli Arabic Twitter feed put out that used a Quranic quote to justify the violence, or rather the response that Israel had mounted against the Gaza Strip, right, in response to Hamas. And this was deeply offensive to a number of folks that I've talked to in the Gulf. And they reached out to me and they said, we cannot support Israel while this kind of stuff is being put up on the Twitter feed. So I reached out to the folks in Israel who were responsible for it, along with a number of other colleagues, and eventually it was removed, and things went back to normal. But I have to say, my disappointment on the part of these Abraham Accord states is I don't expect them to embrace Israel and say Israel is terrific and we love the IDF. That's not what I would expect from them. I would expect for them to slam Hamas as a terrorist organization. I would expect them to slam Iran as the sponsor of that terrorist organization and the purveyor of rockets and other weaponry that have destabilized the Middle East. They did not do that. And I think that was actually their greatest failing. It means that there's still a lot of work to be done, in my view, to shore up the Abraham Accords. I don't think they're going anywhere. I don't think they're going to collapse as a result of the Gaza war, but I think the Gaza war put some strain on them and revealed where maybe some of the weaknesses are in their architecture. So I think now, for those of us that are committed to working with the Gulf states, as I am, the goal now will be to go back out and start to talk to them again about how to build on what they started last year.
So there were some articles saying the Abraham Accords show what a failure it was. I think those were people who were naysayers from the outset anyway. But you would say that what we need to do is strengthen those accords. What about what's happening? There were some discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Anything to worry about in that regard prior to the outbreak of the violence?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to worry about there. I mean, the Saudis coming into the Biden administration had been really treated almost too kindly by the Trump administration, right? I mean, they had been responsible in 2018 for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, this American, or I guess he was a resident here in America, not an American citizen, and he was murdered in the consulate, as everybody knows. On top of that, the Biden administration was also not happy about the war in Yemen. So when the Biden administration came in, they reissued new information about the Khashoggi murder. They pulled support for the campaign in Yemen. They delisted or removed sanctions on the Houthi organization that is sponsored by Iran and has been carrying out terrorist attacks in Saudi. And so the Saudis all of a sudden looked around and realized they had really like no friends in Washington. And they felt very isolated. And that's when I think we began to see indications that the Biden administration was pushing them to begin to engage with Iran, to try to engage in some sort of rapprochement with Iran. And of course, I don't think that's going anywhere because the Saudis hate Iran with a burning passion, and the feeling is mutual on the Iranian side. It's the Sunni Shiite divide within Islam that is, I would say, effectively unbridgeable. But you get a sense right now that the Saudis are being pushed to take steps that they're not comfortable with because of how isolated they are. And they're getting pushed around by the Biden administration. I would say that what we've seen right now is diplomatic arson, given how incredibly important the Saudis have been to the Abraham Accords. None of those peace agreements would have happened unless the Saudis gave a tacit green light. I've been to Saudi 3 or 4 times now over the last couple of years. They are not viewing Israel as an enemy. They really are not. They are still flirting with the idea of formalizing their ties, but in the meantime, they are allowing the other countries in their alliance and then in their orbit to begin to normalize and to soften the ground for Saudi Arabia when they're ready to take that next step. And so I think that what we've seen right now, the last couple of moves made by the Biden administration, is very troubling if what we're trying to do is reshape the region into one where we see Arab-Israeli coexistence.
So what, thank you, Jonathan. What about the what happened within Israel itself among Israeli Arab citizens and in the Palestinian, the areas administered by the Palestinian Authority and so on? Of course, that's something we've never seen before. What is your sense about what that's all about? What does it represent and so on?
Yeah, I mean, look, from the Israeli perspective, the Israeli officials that I talked to during the 11 days of this conflict, that was the only thing they weren't ready for. They were ready for the metro system in Gaza. They were ready for the rockets. They were ready for the heavy salvos that were going to try to overwhelm the Iron Dome system. They were prepared for everything from a military perspective. And then you began to see these, disturbances in Akko and Lod and Ramla, and of course Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah and other places. And this was what they were just unprepared for. There is, I think, and I will say that for those that haven't seen, the chief of police in Israel, a guy by the name of Kobi Shabtai, did a terrific job, I think, in trying to manage this crisis. He spoke out saying that, yes, Arabs that were carrying out violence against Jews in these towns are terrorists, but so are Jews that carried out violence against Arabs, trying to set the tone for the dialogue that has to come next. And there will be a lot of work done between Israel and its Arab citizens because there is clearly a problem. Now, we'll also just in the same breath say that I am curious to learn whether there was state sponsorship of those riots in some shape or form. It's a theory, but all I can tell you is that Turkey, a country that was cheering on Hamas during this conflict, a financial patron, a political patron of Hamas, they have spent a huge amount of time cultivating Islamist groups inside Israel, funding them, supporting them, trying to buy up property, vilifying Israel. This has been a longstanding campaign of theirs. And I have no proof that they were behind it, but I can just tell you is, coincidences in the Middle East just don't happen, not during times of war. So the fact that you had this massive outbreak of domestic unrest while 4,000 rockets were flying into Israel raises questions that I think analysts like myself should be looking at in the weeks and months to come.
So we touched upon what was happening in the Palestinian territories. What about Hezbollah and what came in from the north? There was some, but not so much, and so on. How do you assess Hezbollah and what happened in that front of the war?
Yeah, I mean, look, that was good news. I think Israel has deterrence, and that's an important thing to have in the Middle East. Part of that deterrence, though, has nothing to do with Israel. It has everything to do with the fact that Lebanon is about to collapse. It's about $100 billion in debt right now. It is an insolvent country that's unable to even pay its own electricity bills. The inflation in that country is insane. Right now, if you go to a restaurant, it'll cost you roughly the amount that you pay in rent. It's just the country could become Somalia, and I have a lot of concerns for Israel's stability in the short and long term if this happens. So I think that explains why Hezbollah didn't want to get involved in this war. They probably saw great risk for the people who would have been furious with them. Now, we did see some salvos fired out of Lebanon. That, I have to say, was not surprising, but it was surprising to most. I have a document. It's actually sitting here on my desk. I went into the office the other day to grab it. I was able to get a document that the Israelis sent to the UN in 2018, where they warned that Iran and Turkey were working with Hamas to install Hamas military assets in Lebanon in an attempt in a future conflict to draw Israel into a two-front war. This was their goal. Now, the good news here is that it doesn't look like they were very well organized, didn't have particularly advanced rockets. In fact, the first round of rockets hit the Mediterranean Sea. The second round of rockets fell entirely into Lebanese territory. So this was failure to launch across the board, but it does raise a lot of questions about what may come next. The next round of violence, perhaps Hamas will have better infrastructure and better rockets and potentially draw Lebanon into that next round of conflict. And that is something that Israel does not want.
What did Hamas do better in this war than they did a few years ago? Obviously, their rockets went further. What kind of technology have they improved? What kind of fighting power? It seems not only did Israel learn from the last war and know where they want to take up, but it also seems as if Hamas improved their game plan as well.
Yeah, I know you're going to hear a lot about this from Yossi Cooper-Wasser. I'll just say, for those of you who have not heard Cooper, as he is known, he's great. Highly recommend it. So definitely recommend you tune back into the next presentation. Look, I would point out a couple of things in terms of their capabilities. Obviously, there was the tunnel capabilities; those are destroyed for now, but it's an ongoing issue. They have the ability to make these tunnels, and they're getting better at them. So it'll be something to watch. Israel has, by the way, terrific technology that is able to detect tunnels that snake into Israel. And they have destroyed a large number of those. So Israel continues to fight, again, a war in the shadows, but it'll be something to watch. The things that I was probably most concerned about were the drones that we saw in this most recent conflict. My understanding is that you probably saw the big fireball explosion at the Ashkelon pipeline. That was on, I guess, the second day of the war. That was reportedly a drone, from what I'm able to discern from my sources, and it was able to strike a strategic target. It's, by the way, I think very telling. The Israelis have not talked about that strike since it's happened. I think there's a gag order on it, and probably for good reason. They're concerned about this, that strategic targets can be hit by drones with GPS. And I think we can probably blame Iran for this, although I'd be curious to see whether other countries have contributed to this technology. The other thing that Israel took out before they were able to be used were unmanned underwater vehicles. So these are drones for the ocean that Hamas has developed, again, probably with Iranian assistance. The goal was to go after the Tamar gas fields, to go after Leviathan. And by the way, they also fired, from what I understand, several dozen rockets attempting to hit it in the ocean as well. The Israelis have handled all of those things, but just, I think that is a new front, right? There's going to be always the southern front, there's the northern front, and then there's going to be the gas front. I think moving forward, you're going to see now that Israel is an energy exporter, Hamas is going to try to take that out. So will Iran, so will Hezbollah. So just something to watch. I know Israel's done a lot to defend it, but it's war, things can happen.
Jonathan, in terms of what you've either read in the American press and or seen on American television, and for that matter, European press and television as well, what would you say are some of the things that were the grossest, by that I mean the largest or the most egregious errors in either reporting or the way the situation was covered or presented, or what did they get wrong? What if you were a reporter for AP, what would you have done differently? What have you seen that really we should be aware of that is out there that's just not being corrected and it's giving people a wrong impression of the situation?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of themes that we saw that came out. And it was public discourse, but also things that the media covered. One is this idea of disproportionate force. The idea that a country that is attacked first by an Iran-backed terrorist organization, that it doesn't have a right to defend itself with overwhelming force in response, is an insane proposition. It's, the implication, of course, is that if only there were more casualties on the Israeli side, well, this would make it more of a fair fight. And this continues to be a really troubling narrative, I think. You pick a fight with a regional superpower, you're going to get shellacked. And there will be consequences. And I think Hamas knew this going in. There was no other way that this fight was going to go. When you pick a fight with Israel, we've already seen 4 of these over the last 10 years. We know exactly what happens every time, right? The Israelis are surgical, but there is still going to be damage and there will still be loss of life in response to aggression. This is the reality of war. And so this whole idea of disproportional force it's ridiculous. Second thing is the lack of coverage of Iran in particular and its contribution to this conflict. The fact that Iran provided a lot of the rockets themselves, or the rocket parts, or the training of those that assembled the rockets. These are all things that are very, very well known in terms of Iran's patronage of Hamas. It got very little coverage here in the United States that this is an Iran-backed proxy terrorist organization that launched a war against Israel in the context of a larger conflict between Iran and Israel.
Almost totally not known, right?
Yeah, really unbelievable that such a basic fact would be missing from most articles that came out. So there's that, and then this idea that somehow it's the occupation also continues to drive me crazy, because of course Israel has tried multiple times to end this conflict, right? To actually come to the negotiating table and to provide concrete plans for ending the conflict. And it's been rejected repeatedly. And it continues to get more complicated the longer that the Palestinians reject these overtures. And yet Israel is blamed for what they call the occupation. And by the way, I have to say, the Israelis don't have a problem with that word. They completely understand that they have a military presence in the West Bank and that they control the airspace of the Gaza Strip and they control the shoreline of the Gaza Strip. They understand this, but they also understand that they don't have a choice as long as the Palestinians continue to refuse to engage in good governance and honest diplomacy. It's a fairly straightforward process here, But yet what happens, I think, as you rightly noted up front, you're just going to hear people say, oh, they're killing poor people in Gaza. It's the occupation. They lack, rights. And so it's only natural. That's basically an argument that we should continue to ignore the fact that Israel's been fighting for its own existence since 1948, if not before.
Yeah. So what do you think is the message that those of us who are in the pro-Israel camp should be trying to get out, to be proactive about, to try and counter some of these images in the PR war and media and things like that? If I'm in Hamas's office right now, whatever's left of it, I'm thinking, wow, we scored some victories in terms of American public opinion.
Well, I think that's right. I think they did score some victories, and I think I think Israel has some things that it's going to need to think about. Proposing new plans, trying to figure out how to allow for more material to come into Gaza, although we all know that that is ultimately hijacked and used by Hamas either to generate income or to use parts for the rockets that they ultimately assemble. And this is a huge problem, and I don't know if there's an easy way to solve it. But I have to say that the biggest issue that I think is still looming and is very relevant to this conflict is the Iran angle. The fact that Iran is the sponsor, is the patron for Hamas, for the training, for the rockets, for all of the tactics that it's carried out. It needs to be said repeatedly. There is no other way to analyze this other than to note that this is an Iranian proxy waging war under the banner of Palestinian nationalism, but there were real goals here for Iran, and Hamas helped achieve those, and we can't ignore that. But the other thing here is just looking to the future. We've got to point out the flaws of this Iran nuclear deal, noting how incredibly dangerous this nuclear deal could be for future conflicts between Hamas and Israel. If tens or even more than $100 billion flows to Iran and that money trickles back to Gaza, what we just saw in this latest round of conflict will look rather pleasant compared to
Yet
what
it seems as if, like what you're saying, I hate to put it on the administration, it doesn't seem as if they're connecting the dots in terms of wanting to move forward with a treaty with renewing the treaty with Iran. Any possibility that maybe they've learned that we shouldn't, this just should not be JCPOA, the rerun of it. Any thoughts about they're trying to tighten it a little bit, or as a result of this experience to learn anything from it, or are they just not quite connecting?
No, I think there is a game of disconnect the dots going on. I think there is a refusal to acknowledge the fact that they will be contributing to the regional strife by re-entering the deal. Look, there are things that are being said by the administration right now. The rhetoric is that they're going to be tougher on Iran. It's going to be harder for Iran to do all these things that they've done in the past. Except they're getting right back into the same deal that we saw in 2015, which yielded Iran $150 billion in sanctions relief, give or take, and that's just an insane proposition when you think about it. The rhetoric has been tougher. They keep talking about a longer or stronger deal, but as my colleague Mark Dubowitz, who is a congregant of B'nai Tzedek, he calls it the Tom and Kerry show. That they are talking tough like Tom Cotton, but they're negotiating like John Kerry. And that's the unfortunate reality. I think we're not likely to see anything.
So I'm glad you mentioned Secretary Kerry. I want to get back to the conflict in a moment. I have a couple other questions, but I did want to ask that thing that came out a couple of weeks ago about Kerry passing along to the Iranians information about Israeli strikes and so on. What do you know about that, Jonathan, in terms of Kerry? And then it seems as the story kind of disappeared.
It did disappear. The story is that John Kerry it basically explained to the Iranians that the Israelis had been striking in Syria and elsewhere, that these were operations that the Israelis had denied. Again, I talked about that kind of gray zone conflict that's been going on. The Israelis didn't talk about this. It was intelligence that apparently looked to have been shared between Israel and the United States. And it appeared that John Kerry violated that intelligence sharing agreement and exposed Israeli operations. It's curious to me whether he violated American clearance regulations as well. I don't expect that he'll be held to account for that. But that was basically what happened. The Israelis were actually somewhat muted about it. I think maybe for understandable reasons, and the administration, I think, was very happy for that story to disappear. But we had some Iranian speaking analysts at FDD where I work, and they looked at the script, and apparently it all checked out. And so Kerry, let's just say he violated the trust of the Israelis at minimum.
Right. So let's just hope he keeps, as I like to tell friends, drain this cup with the environment. That's his big issue right now. In regard to getting back to what's happening the morning after, in the Palestinian area, we've got Hamas, we've got Islamic Jihad, we've got Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, and maybe they'll have elections again, maybe they won't, who knows. Are there any people in Palestinian areas we should be rooting for or hoping that they kind of, come up to the top or anything like that? Are there any good guys out there?
Look, there are the former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, who's actually based here in Princeton right now, was a tremendous reformer and somebody who's truly, I think, committed to coexistence with Israel. He actually, in a meeting that I had with him a number of years ago, he told me that he approached Palestinian nationalism in the same spirit as the Zionists from the Yishuv. That you needed to build recognized institutions first, and then when recognition is ready by the international community, those institutions will be, they'll be functioning, and you'll have the opportunity to create a state. So he's terrific, and I'd love to see him return. It's unclear what kind of constituents he has. There are other people. An interesting person to split from the Fatah PLO faction was a guy by the name of Nasser al-Kidwa. He is actually the nephew of Yasser Arafat, and he decided that he was against Mahmoud Abbas's authoritarian rule in the West Bank. Of course, Mahmoud Abbas is now 16 years into a 4-year term, and he doesn't seem to want to go anywhere. So Kidwa breaks from the main party and challenges them, and actually seem to be getting a fair amount of support. So that's an interesting person to watch. The problem, though, is that Mahmoud Abbas has not allowed for an active political scene in the West Bank since probably around 2007, when Hamas overtook the Gaza Strip by force. Since that war, he has really ruled the West Bank with an iron fist. So it's even hard right now to determine who the front runners and big players could be in a Palestinian political scene. But it's certainly something to watch.
How about the guy who was in is he in Bahrain or UAE? His name Dahlan. Is he anybody a possible player as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Dahlan. It's actually very funny. We took a donor trip to the UAE, and we met with him, and the number of selfies that guy took with our group was kind of hilarious. He's a sort of I guess he's got a cult following in the Palestinian-Israeli arena. He's not exactly a Democrat. He was close with Yasser Arafat, and he was the strongman in the Gaza Strip until it was overtaken by Hamas. He's got a lot of support from the UAE, which I think could be potentially helpful. Certainly, I think seems to be well funded. I don't know what his ideas are and whether they square with democratic principles or anything like that. But he'll have a role to play, as will a number of others. I think the key, though, is to try to find the candidate who will bring the most change, the most reform. Because, as I've argued in my books and a lot of writing, the biggest problem right now within the Palestinian arena is, apart from the terrorism and illicit finance that comes with it, it's really just a matter of corruption. There is just no trust among the Palestinian people for either party, either Gaza, in Gaza where Hamas rules, or in the West Bank where the PLO rules. Neither are trusted. Both are seen as highly corrupt, and really not fighting for ultimately, the growth of a Palestinian state. They're still trying to fight a war, or holding on to power for dear life, but certainly not looking at progress.
it is amazing just the dysfunctionality in terms of it really being such a kleptocracy and where the money is put, and just that, you know, donors still continue to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the Gaza Strip and to the Palestinian Authority. Jonathan, one of the things that you wrote about in one of your articles, many people on our call today may be aware of this, but many may not be, the TikTok craze.
Yeah, you know,
In terms of what happened with the Arab, was it Israeli Arabs or Palestinians and the Haredi community? Can you just
yeah,
enlighten everyone on that, please?
yeah. I mean, very briefly, there was a series of videos that came out. It was a sort of a viral thing where they were, promoting videos that either encouraged the beating of Jews or actually showed in some cases, and it was popular, and it was something that happened leading up to the canceled elections, and obviously leading up to this most recent round of conflict. So when you see, you know, some of the things that are happening in the streets of Ramla or Lod or elsewhere, or even in Bethlehem, where apparently there was an exchange of live fire with rioters this morning, you know, that none of this should come as a massive surprise. I have to say the thing that surprises me more is, quite honestly, the anti-Semitism that we're seeing on the streets of LA and New York and, you know, in Las Vegas and places like that. That is far more disturbing, just because it's not something that we're used to seeing in the West Bank. You know, and in Arab Israeli towns, hatred for Israel is worn out on one sleeve. It's something that people are proud of, but not here in the U.S. That's something different entirely.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing a rise of anti-Semitism that's all linked to this, and lack of a hesitancy, shall we say, for people to be out there marching against Israel and Zionism and Jews as well, and so on. So it's a whole different kind of a feeling of what's going on these days. Jonathan, we have about a minute or two left, and so if I could just ask you, before I ask you my last question, I just want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone for being on our call, and remind everyone that on Monday we're going to continue the conversation at 10 a.m. Just go to zionistrabbis.org, sign up for the conversation with Yossi Cooperwasser. That'll be on Monday. And then on Thursday, it will be this open forum for members of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, open only to rabbis who are members, to talk about where we go from here, where we are, and so on and so forth. So if you're on the call and you're a rabbi and you haven't yet joined, please consider joining zionistrabbis.org. If you're not a rabbi, please go to our website, consider making a contribution. And if you are a rabbi, please, it's a rabbinic letter only. Go ahead and sign our petition, which you can find also on our website, which is a support for Israel at a time when certainly other voices are being heard. So Jonathan, last words that I wanted to ask you, just in terms of where do we go from here vis-a-vis you know, in terms of the relationship between Israel and the United States, any need to worry about aspects of that, and or you know, what way can we help to strengthen Israel, those of us who are lovers and supporters of Israel at this time?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a good question. I mean, I think number one is, you know, we need to see that weapons purchase go through. I saw today that there is an effort by Bernie Sanders to block it in the Senate. The implications of that are grave for a number of reasons, but just, you know, the two things that Israel needs are Iron Dome interceptors to protect innocent civilians from being rocketed by Hamas or by Hezbollah. Crucial that they get this, because without that, not only will you see many more deaths and casualties on the Israeli side, but then you'll see an IDF that wants to respond in kind. And that's where you could really see the deterioration in a future conflict. The ability to stop that loss of life is ultimately what keeps these operations contained and relatively manageable. If it was not happening, I shudder to think about it. The other thing, of course, is they're talking about holding precision guided munitions. These PGMs are what enables Israel to strike surgically, so that there are not mass casualties when they strike a target, you know, in the middle of the street in Gaza. Right, very, very precision bombs that don't have the kind of blast radius and you know, won't miss their target. You can actually, they can watch up until the very last second that they hit things. The video coming out of the IDF is remarkable how precise they are. So those two things are really important, actually, in my view, to preventing more conflict or at least containing it in the future. The only other thing that I'll just say is the other area to watch is the Iran deal. Can't stress it enough that, heading back into the Iran deal will open up a lot of tension between the United States and Israel. It's been contained up until now, but the Israelis will, I think, understandably not be happy about the United States providing a huge amount of cash to its avowed enemy, an enemy that is, declared its intent to destroy the Jewish state. So it really does not look good from Israel's perspective. You're going to see, I think, continued gray zone warfare. You're going to see continued diplomatic statements and other things that will absolutely, inject tension into the relationship. The U.S. appears content with this and seems okay. The Biden administration says it's something that can be managed. I hope they're right, because I think the Israelis are deeply concerned.
Oh, Jonathan, one other quick question I wanted to ask you. Israel dropped how many bombs in the Gaza Strip during this conflict?
No, I don't have that number. I have to go and, I haven't gotten the after action yet from the IDF.
Okay, because
I should be able to share that with you.
Because I was wondering, because one of the things is there were in the Palestinian area of Gaza, there were about 240 casualties, of which most of them were, of course, of individuals, terrorists. Many, there were those who were not. One of the things that was amazing, just talking about the precision aspect of it, that if you think about it, how many buildings were destroyed, how many bombs were dropped there, and the relatively small loss of life, if anything, disproportionate, to use their word about that, is something. So it might be interesting. Jonathan, people want to follow your writings. How do they, where can they go to get your articles? I know you send them out regularly.
Sure. I have a mailing list. If you would like to get on my list, just send me an email. It's just JS, my initials, at fdd.org. JS at fdd.org. That's the easiest way. I'll sign you up.
Thank you.
And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Jonathan, for an unbelievably enlightening presentation. Really, I think, shed a tremendous amount of sharing with us, tremendous amount of important information. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and to everyone who's with us as well. Please come back on Monday and for Yossi's presentation. Until then, Shabbat Shalom. Thanks.